It was a war that tore a nation apart, fought in the jungles of Vietnam and in the streets of America. A brutal conflict that changed the course of history and still echoes today. This is the story of the Vietnam War.
That's the movement of refugees to the area of their choice.
Vietnam's modern conflict began under French rule in the 1800s. By the early 20th century, Vietnamese nationalists sought independence. Among them was Nguyen Sinh Cung, better known as Ho Chi Minh. Inspired by communism, he formed the Viet Minh during World War II. They fought the Japanese, then turned their weapons on the French. In 1954, the French lost a devastating siege at Dien Bien Phu. Their colonial rule collapsed. The Geneva Accords soon divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, north under Ho Chi Minh and south under anti-communist Ngo Dinh Diem. America feared the domino effect, that if Vietnam fell, all of Asia would turn red. So under President Eisenhower, military advisors were sent. Under JFK, their numbers grew. By 1963, there were 16,000 U.S. personnel in Vietnam.
What the revolution looked like in South Vietnam's capital city of Saigon on Saturday morning. All night Friday, the guns of the revolutionary forces had been firing on the loyal government troops and their installations. All night the shells had fallen on or near the presidential palace, where President Ngo Dinh Diem and his advisor brother Ngo Dinh Nhu refused to surrender. Snipers were everywhere. The city streets rang with the rapid explosion of mortar shells over a background of shouts and cries. Tank guns were firing and submachine guns. The revolutionary forces had clearly moved according to a well-constructed plan, and they carried it out with skill, sealing off sections of the noisy, smoking city and neutralizing the government forces neighborhood by neighborhood. It was planned with intelligence. That would be a soldier's view. But even among soldiers, the battle broke down into little pieces and became a man with a gun guarding a man who had had a gun but now knelt on the side.
Diem, though anti-communist, was deeply unpopular. On November 2nd, 1963, he was assassinated in a military coup with U.S. knowledge. Just 3 weeks later, President Lyndon B. Johnson escalated the war.
In international waters in the Gulf of Tonkin, destroyers of the United States Navy are assigned routine patrols from time to time. Sunday, August the 2nd, 1964, the destroyer Maddox was on such a patrol. Shortly after noon, the calm of the day is broken as general quarters sound. In a deliberate and unprovoked action, 3 North Vietnam PT boats unleash a torpedo attack against the Maddox.
The official story about the Gulf of Tonkin was a lie.
The destroyer was carrying out a mission of patrol in those waters, in international waters. When it was attacked,
but it quickly became accepted as the absolute truth by the news media. And because of the press's refusal to challenge that story, it was much easier for Congress to quickly pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was pivotal because it opened the floodgates to the Vietnam War.
Well, I think it's a very clear demonstration of the unity of the country behind the policies that are being followed by the president in South Vietnam, and more specifically of the action that was taken in response to the attack upon our destroyers.
At that point, the facts were secondary. In the case of the Washington Post reporting, I asked more than 3 decades later whether there had ever been a Post retraction of its reporting on the Gulf of Tonkin events. And I called the newspaper and eventually reached the man who had been the chief diplomatic correspondent for the paper at the time, Murray Martyr, and I said, Mr. Martyr, has there ever been a retraction by the Washington Post of its fallacious reporting on the Gulf of Tonkin? And he said, I can assure you it never happened. There was never any retraction. And I asked why. And he said, well, if the news media were going to retract its reporting on the Gulf of Tonkin, it would have to retract its reporting on virtually the entire Vietnam War.
On August 2nd, 1964, the destroyer USS Maddox clashed with North Vietnamese boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. A second questionable attack followed. Johnson used this to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving him authority to wage war . By 1965, the first combat troops landed in Vietnam. Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive bombing campaign, began. By 1967, America had over 485,000 troops on the ground. But instead of a quick victory, the U.S. was dragged into a brutal guerrilla war. The Viet Cong, communist insurgents in the South, fought a war of shadows, ambushes, tunnels, traps. The U.S. relied on superior firepower, but couldn't win local hearts and minds.
A South Vietnamese official, the military chief of Quang Ngai province, today denied charges that American soldiers on the ground executed several hundred villagers in March of 1968. The province chief said the civilians died in air and artillery strikes that leveled the village after a number of Americans had been killed there by Viet Cong snipers. The villagers' version of the incident was given by survivors yesterday. They said a patrol of 100 Americans stormed into the hamlet, drove all the residents out of their huts, then opened fire with automatic weapons. 2 American soldiers, one an officer, the other an enlisted man, are being held in this country in connection with the case, but neither has been brought to trial.
On March 16, 1968, American troops killed over 500 civilians in My Lai. The cover-up failed, and trust in the mission collapsed. And with that action created one of the most iconic pictures of the war, showing how cruel humans can actually be. In the early hours of January 30th, 1968, during a supposed ceasefire, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese launched the Tet Offensive. Over 100 towns and cities were attacked, including the U.S. Embassy in Saigon.
The raiders were everywhere else. By daylight, Tonkin Boulevard, where the embassy is located, was a battleground. No one, unless identified, was allowed in the street.
Get back!
An Australian military policeman was standing guard, firing warning shots to keep the street clear. The bodies of 2 American military policemen who died as they tried to assault the compound lay near their jeep across the boulevard. This is where the Viet Cong raiders broke in. They'd sneaked up and blasted a hole in the reinforced concrete fence surrounding the compound. They had the big embassy wall to protect them. They were inside before anyone knew it. But none of the raiders lived to tell of their exploit. By 8 o'clock, 5 hours after they first broke in, almost all of them were dead. All in civilian clothes, they'd been armed with American M16 rifles and also rocket launchers and rockets. They had explosives, their purpose apparently to destroy the embassy. In that purpose, they did not succeed.
The U.S. regained control, but at a cost. The myth of American progress was shattered. Even news anchor Walter Cronkite said, "It seems more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in stalemate." President Lyndon B. Johnson chose not to seek re-election. In 1969, President Nixon introduced Vietnamization, pulling out U.S. troops while training South Vietnamese forces. Yet behind the scenes, the war expanded into Cambodia and Laos, targeting supply lines like the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Tear gas first started down the commons, then the guard moved up on both sides of Taylor Hall and forced the kids off the commons. Then one group, I don't know how many there were, 50 maybe, perhaps more, perhaps less, moved down into the practice football field.
After you feed them, then what will we do? Will you ask them to leave?
They've got grievances, they've got demands. There are demands on both sides. We have to talk.
And then there were a whole lot of kids around them. A few kids were throwing sticks and stones, but that was only a handful, not more than 10, 15. And then the guard shot some tear gas up on the hill to disperse the crowd, and the kids picked it up and threw it back.
We'll fly out. We'll make a perimeter, a circle, right out in here. From the right, you move out. You start a big circle around here. You don't talk during a state of emergency, Mike. You know that. Come on.
I'm sorry, but
we'll
I don't
talk
want
as soon
people
as
shot.
we get this settled down.
I don't want people shot on this campus, just as a citizen of this campus.
Who wants people
All
shot?
right, but they're sitting quietly.
Okay, will you ask them to leave?
This area immediately. Leave this area immediately.
And all of a sudden I heard the shooting. And then I saw people dropping to the ground, and then I fell to the ground also, because I couldn't walk anymore.
What the investigators have to determine then is whether indeed there was a sniper and whether the guard was justified in firing its weapons, or whether, as some people here believe, the guard, under the pressure of a rock-throwing attack, panicked and fired its weapons indiscriminately, killing 4 people.
As the war widened, so did protests. On May 4th, 1970, National Guardsmen shot and killed 4 students at Kent State University during an anti-war protest. On January 27th, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. America would leave. Fighting continued. Then, in March 1975, the North launched a final assault. On April 30th, as helicopters evacuated Americans from rooftops, Saigon fell.
Saigon, April the 30th, 8 o'clock. The last American helicopter on the roof of the American Embassy prepares to lift off the last of the evacuees. Those who failed on that last day to get a place on the helicopters and who had reason to fear the communist takeover made for the only route that still offered a chance of escape, the Saigon River. On board the ships, the scene was fantastic. Helicopters queued up with light aircraft as Vietnamese pilots used anything that could fly to make their escape from the mainland. To make more room on the flight decks, empty helicopters were pushed over the side, a last crazy expense in a $200 billion war. And then, shortly after midday, came the climax of 30 years of fighting. 5 hours after the last helicopter had left, the first communist columns entered Saigon, North Vietnamese tanks flying the local Viet Cong flag. They trundled into the grounds of the presidential palace, where General Min calmly surrendered his country in a simple ceremony.
The Vietnam War left over 58,000 Americans dead. Over 3 million Vietnamese died. Countless others were displaced, wounded, or traumatized. It left scars on soldiers, on families, on both nations. It shaped how America saw itself and how future wars would be fought. And yet, amid the tragedy, it taught lessons the world would never forget. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe and like to support our channel so we can post even more videos.